Hello everyone, my name is Nathan and I spent 2,872 cycles with a single duplicant. And this is the story of what happened. To get things started, of course, I had to eliminate the extra duplicants, so I arranged a little scenario to get rid of them and then just looked away. As Steve and Marie spent their time in the water doing nothing, Nathan already got started preparing everything required for initial survival. I also installed a bed, a wash basin and a toilet. The rest of the cycle I spent already digging a ladder shaft. That's our first meal and our first poop. Now it was time for our first power generator and science setup in order to progress in the tech tree. Nathan, of course, had to do everything by himself, including generating the power and doing the research. I then decided to go for an upper level that is gonna become the mess hall for dinner. And just in under 10 cycles, I got myself a little cozy living area with all the basics in place. After that, I decided to start expanding downstairs for even more machines and functionality. I tried to keep the fresh water inside of the area for future consumption and easy access. In the meantime, of course, I kept making progress in terms of research as much as I could, and soon enough it was time for our first oxygen mask system. The toilet, of course, needed to be cleaned, nothing to frown upon, Nathan. And I also kept making my way up and down in order to start exploring my surroundings. We were now already at the stage of adding the supercomputer and getting into advanced research. I then decided it's time to secure a bunch of resources all around the world so they don't influence the biomes negatively. I also made a little pocket in order to drain all of the polluted water into a chamber for later use. Of course, this came with some complications because we don't have access to the Atmo suits yet, therefore I had to install my first triage card. But let me tell you, it was all worth it. It was now time for the next machine, a rock crusher and a kiln. Inside the toilet, I installed a farm tile in order to plant some thimbleweed, and we're going to be using the polluted water from the toilet to feed that plant. We now also unlocked the fire pole, so it was about time to add one of those. To make things a little bit more bearable, I decided to install deodorizers all the way around. This would also allow me to get rid of the accumulating slime lung. As I was traveling around, I started to discover more and more biomes upstairs. After a while, I made it all the way up to space almost, so I decided it's time to stop exploring towards the upstairs and focus on the downstairs next. And just ignore any corpses you might encounter down there. Once I made it all the way to the oil biome, I was somewhat satisfied with my progress. So now I wanted to focus on making a proper entry and exit to the base with our future Atmo suits, and that of course also required a liquid lock. There was our Atmo suit checkpoint and of course 2 docks, so we were able to alternate between 2 suits. It was also time to add a bunch of pumps that will actually supply the Atmo suit stations, and of course we supplied all of this with an oxygen diffuser. Once the Atmo suits were in place, of course we were lacking the power, so it was time to add some coal generators, including a smart battery. Of course, we also wanted to automate this process, so it was time for our first auto sweeper that required us to spec into mechatronics engineering. I then decided to go for a toilet upgrade so we can do this with plumbing and don't actually have to invest duplicant labor to clean the toilet and exchange the water. I also took the opportunity to install a water sieve to recycle the water that we're using from the toilet, and of course eventually we will be feeding the excess into the thimbleweed. I then decided to tap into all of my water sources in order to ship the water up into my storage area. With the water sieve and the plumbing in the joint, it was time to replace all of the infrastructure with the upgraded version, including the hydroponics farm tile. And if we have a quick look at that satisfying poop, this is much better. I started to increase my machinery skill in order to tune up the power generators, but this turned out to be a little bit of a waste of duplicant labor that I should spend on something else, considering we only have 1 duplicant. So instead, I decided it's time to explore towards the sites, figure out what else we can find in the world. Also, of course, it was desirable to make our duplicant as good as possible, so I put him into any neural vacillator that I could find to get some extra traits. At this point, I quickly want to mention that this is a recap of a series of 74 episodes. I would extremely appreciate your support on this video in order to get the message out this series exists. It will be pinned in the comments and also in the description. So if you want to have a deeper dive into how this all came to be, there's an entire series waiting for you. But if not, you would do me me a huge favor just leaving a like on this one. I kept exploring and expanding the base throughout the cycles, as you do in Oni. Also, of course, we kept on exploring, touching all the biomes and revealing the terrain. Over time, of course, we used more neural vacillators, and I kept on exploring the terrain as good as possible. It was then time to set up an infrastructure upstairs in order to also be able to utilize atmosuits and be protected from the elements. In order to boost my duplicant's morale, I made sure that the main ladder shaft is a nature reserve. And this actually made a huge difference for us to be able to select more skills. After a while, I just wasn't happy with my current oxygen system anymore, so I decided to go for a different system based on electrolyzers that is gonna stand the test of time. This setup here is one that I really like to use. It is enough to supply 8 duplicants, and therefore also our single duplicant should have no issues. So I kept on giving this the necessary functionality, piping everything up, adding hydrogen power and automation. It was then time to introduce the water and get this thing rolling. And just like that, we had our first self-powered and self-cooling oxygen generation in place. With our atmosuits in place, I decided it's time to be a little bit more daring, maybe set up a smeltery setup here in the ice biome. So this is exactly what I ended up doing, adding a bunch of coal generators to supply the future smelting system. I hooked everything up to big cabling and made sure the ice biome was able to keep things cool. Once the smeltery was in place, I just had to add a little pipe cooling system through the ice biome, a little bit of temperature checking, etc. And this then finally allowed us to smelt our ores professionally, and we would be able to use this location for multiple hundreds of cycles. By now, we explored a quite big portion of the starting planetoid and we knew what was going on. I decided to dig a little bit deeper into the oil biome. It was time to get rid of some of this terrain and make some space for more functionality. So this would be a site that I often see huge portions of the starting planetoid being dug out. However, Nathan was not afraid to make good progress here, as you can see. And he kept getting better and better, quicker and quicker with his skills. Yes, and we literally decided to dig out the entirety of the oil biome. Why not? Is what I told myself back then. More neural vacillator action. Nathan is just enjoying it. What can I say? Once the biome has been dug out, I decided to set up a few oil wells. It turned out we didn't really require them because the initial oil in the biome was just quite enough. I still decided to go for initial setup that I could just turn on and off if I wanted to, or if things got a little bit too heated. I then ventured out into another ice biome to set up a polymer press and a oil refinery. This would allow me to get my first petroleum and plastic in the joint. Very important to get some features that you can't get otherwise. The setup I went for was an easy one and manual, so my duplicant would be spending some of his time here just turning the wheel, but we finally got access to plastics. At this point, we needed to add some setups in order to generate rat bolts for future research, so I decided to go for another research station here in the same biome, using the Weeswarts as a natural radiation generator. The setup was very easy but usable, and it would allow me to get that cheap initial research out of the way. Hooray! And with access to plastic, it was of course time to make our first transit tube setup. The time wasted just traveling was horrendous. It turns out in the future we didn't need the travel tubes anymore because my duplicant's athletic kept training up to the point we were faster just running instead of using the travel tubes. As I was running out of chores and sanity, I decided for some reason to make a resource shaft on the left side. I never actually ended up using it. It's a huge shame because it took me hours. Basically, my goal was in the future to give me access to resources and building materials everywhere. And so I also decided for a new location for my atmosuit. So this would be the only exit out of my base in the future. I kept on digging the shaft. I feel physical pain looking back at this now. Of course, I kept on expanding my transit tube system to be able to reach all areas of the planetoid. I was then slowly running out of initial food, so I tried to come up with a setup for meal lights that would be in a restricted room so I don't just go back to farm the plots whenever they are ready, but maybe do it after bedtime. I eventually managed to finish the entirety of the shaft. I mean, it doesn't matter, I would have ended up excavating the terrain in due time anyways. I figured this would now be a good opportunity to analyze our first geysers, maybe for additional natural gas power. So I tried to come up with a little setup here in order to tame this geyser and make it useful to us. I installed a bunch of natural gas generators, smart batteries, some functionality to hopefully keep everything contained in a single room. It turned out that we needed a little bit more functionality than I initially thought, and I also wanted to implement some additional natural gas storage to take care of the excess. After a while, I somewhat got it to work, everything should be taken care of, and this actually will help us for the next 2000 cycles, just with some extra power. I then needed access to new materials, so it was time to introduce a glass forge as well, and I simply used the ice biome I'm already using for the refinery. I then also started to dig away the terrain at the very top of the planetoid to go for our first solar panel setup. Of course, that meant digging and digging. I wouldn't be surprised if I dug up a million tiles throughout the entire series. I managed to dig away the entirety of the terrain and got my first few solar panels running on a heavy watt wire. By now, we explored the entirety of the planetoid, and it was just about revealing the resources that we have access to. As you can see, more and more of the terrain just disappeared, and it was about time to clean things up a little bit. In order to do so, I installed a couple of auto sweepers with dispensers, and of course, once installed, you can see this would allow me to ship the resources very efficiently, much faster than with just one duplicant. So basically at this point we are stable enough to just go on a big digging spree, collect all these materials and resources, make some space for bigger infrastructure. Now that I had the space, I wanted to go for a good food setup that would allow me to keep cooking high quality food for my duplicant and maybe just a little bit of extra. I wanted this to be as automatic and clean as possible, so I had to come up with a design for an automatic farm. I ended up building 2 rooms that will have to be temperature regulated separately, and here at the very bottom I decided to make the cooling system that allows me to regulate set temperatures. Lots and lots of piping and some automation was going on here, but eventually we made it. I ended up filling up the Sleetweed room with oxygen, and we would be cooling this room down with hydrogen pipes. After that, all I had to do is add a bunch of pips together with the seeds in order to make them plant them, and therefore the plants could grow naturally. After a while, all the plants have been planted and the functionality was in place, the cooling loops were filled up and flowing. I also made sure to add some chlorine into the storage tile, so food would be disinfected and of course also frozen inside. At this point, I was becoming more interested in the second planetoid, which we could reach here with the teleporter, so I decided to scout it out. I just had a quick look around the planetoid, made some initial setups for water and a toilet, just to get some things rolling and be able to spend multiple cycles here without going nuts. After a while, I went back to the main planetoid in order to analyze more of the geyser and vents we have hanging around. We found all sorts of stuff, including cobalt volcanoes, copper volcanoes, just overall very useful features. I decided to make a connection with the 2 planetoids using the teleporter system. This way I would be able to ship materials back and forth. I then went back to the second planetoid in order to completely explore it, figure out what we should do overall with it. Of course, one interesting biome to explore was the uranium one with the beta hives, so these guys could go ahead and start refining the uranium ore for me to use in the future. I then started to make a division between space and the planetoid itself, in preparation to also dig out the entire planetoid here. Why did I do that? Well, I cannot really tell you. I just have to dig out the entire planetoids. I just have to do it. After a while, I ran out of food, so I went back home in order to cook berry sludge, the food that will get us through the rest of this playthrough. I also ended up making a division between the uranium biome and the rest of the planetoid, and as you can see, we ended up digging it all out. What am I doing with my life? Now that the planetoid was dug out, it was time to set up more infrastructure such as batteries. I of course also ended up building a whole bunch of solar panels, and I even started to replace some of the ladders with plastic ladders to make me faster. I had to go up and down these like 1,000 times. Of course, I also ended up adding a bedroom and a mess hall for some morale boost on the second planetoid. Of course, I also ended up cleaning everything up, because I can't just leave everything on the floor, how could I? I also made sure to prepare all the volcanoes so we could tap into them in the future fairly safely, even if they aren't dormant. I then figured it is time to start hooking up some of these precious volcanoes on the second planetoid, so I tried to come up with a little design that will automatically harvest the volcanoes' materials and cool them down. By this time we also needed access to the last type of research, my most favorite one, the virtual planetarium. But we were definitely working ourselves up the ranks now 1,000 cycles have passed. I added some more functionality to the contraption, including the self-cooling. I then also filled it up with some initial water before we could finally get it running, removing the tile that blocked it from erupting. And just like that, we now had access to unlimited refined gold metal. This design actually seemed to be working so well that I decided to do the same exact thing for the iron volcano. I even did the same thing for the aluminium volcano that was located further down the second planetoid. This was actually a huge relief, already 3 metals out of the way, and with enough time passing we basically had an unlimited amount of it. My next goal was to make a setup for all the water and polluted water geysers, which would eradicate our future water needs entirely. I decided to make this a rather large contraption in order to be able to also clean the germs and cool it to temperature, and then it would be delivered to the main planetoid. Of course, now that we got all these refined materials, I needed a way to bring them down further than the steam temperature, maybe to a cozy 20 degrees or so. And so I decided to come up with a cooling loop system combined with metal tiles just for that task. In order to clean the water and the salt water, I also had to come up with an infrastructure with a water sieve and a desalinator. I ended up rebuilding it a couple of times, but eventually I found a configuration that is taking care of all the problems. The materials would then come directly from the volcanoes, be cooled to a cozy 15 to 20 degrees and ready to be shipped over to the main planetoid. After that, it was time to come up with a system to cool our water output to usable temperatures as well. So I ended up with this system taking care of this nasty polluted water, making it usable for us. In order to take care of the germs, I decided to make this little room that we're gonna pump our water through filled with chlorine to kill off all the germs. There was still another something to take care of, and that is the polluted oxygen vents. I decided I wanted to use these in combination with sand and deodorizers to produce clay. I connected the 2 steam vents together and made a little setup to take care of this process. There was just a little bit of functionality required here, a little bit of a pipe setup here to keep things cool, and then eventually I would just connect the 2 vents together to force all the polluted oxygen through the deodorizers. I wanted to disinfect the resulting clay material, so I decided to lead it through a series of doors made out of uranium ore. This would then go ahead and remove any slime lung germs still present on the clay. In the meantime, I went back to the main planetoid to start digging out the rest of the terrain that I still wanted to get rid of. At this point, I was kind of fed up with my starter base, and I decided to go for a new permanent base that would take me through the rest of this playthrough. I went ahead and decided for a spot for my transit tube and planned out some functionality such as a nature reserve and the future oxygen production. I used carpeted tiles and gold metal tiles in order to keep my decorations as high as possible, and of course we also wanted space for all of the rooms such as bathrooms, a great hall and a bedroom. The layout was slowly but surely coming together and started to take shape. In this new base, I made sure to have everything, access to unlimited oxygen. I also installed machinery such as carbon skimmers. And of course, the cooling system couldn't be missed here as well. We wanted this base at a steady, nice temperature. And with all that out of the way, we now had a proper living module worthy of my duplicant. Now that the new base was ready, it was about time to take apart everything that was left of the old base, so this was definitely a huge milestone here. And I have to say, taking things apart is also a lot of fun at times. And with the oxygen system in place as well, it was time to permanently move to this new living module. By now we had the entirety of the main planetoid dug out, so I decided to tap into all of the metal volcanoes that were left on it. There was a nice combination of 2 copper volcanoes that I could bring together in a single design. The design I was going for here was the exact same design we used on the second planetoid for taming all the other volcanoes, and it turned out to be a good decision for the copper as well. After a while, I managed to finish both of the contraptions for the double copper volcano, and it turned out pretty nice, I gotta say. I figured it might now be time to move my metal refinery and glass forge setup over to the copper volcano, since we had a little bit of space there, and I just made a little platform to prepare everything. I wanted to use a separate cooling system for the metals that I'm gonna be producing, and then I started to place my glass forge and auto sweepers. Everything should be as automatic as possible. Of course, I still need my duplicant to actually execute the refinery and glass forge tasks, but I ended up placing 2 refineries. This was a mistake. 1 would have been enough. I decided to supply the materials with conveyor loaders, which would then lead into receptacles and the auto sweepers could take from them. With the entirety of the system and the cooling loop for the smeltery in place, I introduced some oil as a coolant. And just like that, we were now capable of cooling down some of the metals that we were smelting up in the refineries, and they would be dropping here on the floor for now for me to collect. For a while, I noticed we have a whole bunch of liquids here at the bottom, so I thought it would be time to find a more permanent storage solution for it to get this mess at the bottom cleaned up. I decided to go for a extremely large setup with lots and lots of liquid reservoirs for backup. So I ended up with large areas for each type of liquid. First and foremost, of course, the water and polluted water, but we eventually also wanted to collect oil, petroleum, and what have you. I ended up making certain storages much larger, such as the water storage, contrary to, let's say, the petroleum storage. With each type of liquid, the piping got a little bit more complicated, but in the end, it actually looks fascinating, even though it is a tiny bit spaghetti. The next thing I needed was a solution to easily cool down the liquids, if necessary, to the temperatures we usually want to make use of them. I also installed a couple of desalinators right here to take care of the salt water. And of course, what started innocently kind of became more complicated than I wanted to. Naturally, we also needed aqua tuners and a proper steam room to provide the necessary cooling. I even ended up installing a bunch of uranium mechanized airlocks in order to eliminate the germs inside the water in case we still find some. And just like that, we now had a proper storage room for all the liquids and we were ready to clean this mess up here at the bottom. To do so, of course, we had to add a whole bunch of pipings and some filters, an elaborate pumping system, so it would be a huge waste of energy, but at this point energy wasn't really a concern. I also decided to completely take apart the old smelting system and the biome that we melted, operating it over there. Now at this point I could already tell that we're going to require a larger storage for the water as well as the oil, so I decided to go for an infinite liquid setup here that will be taking care of these two materials. We could go ahead and fill up these initial 2 rows with water and then add another liquid in order to trick the game to never overpressure the liquid vent. So I ended up doing just that. As of this point, this is an infinite liquid storage and we can store as much oil in there as we wish. At this point though, power slowly became a concern, so I decided to tap into the magma biome and I just wanted to come up with a little geothermal plant that will be helping us out with those power issues. It turned out this would be the last significant power system I set up, because this huge magma biome was just giving off heat like there's no tomorrow and I literally never ran out. Of course, in the future I added more steam turbines, but you get the basic gist. The heat was more than enough. I had to get a little bit of automation going together with a steel door to relay the heat into the steam room, and then we could just go ahead, add a little bit of water to it. This should be it, close the door, and this would then heat up the water extremely quickly. And that was the birth of our geothermal plant that lasted for the next 1200 cycles. With our newfound access to liquid, I was kind of intrigued about maybe utilizing it to build a petroleum boiler. I decided to make the room easily accessible with a transit tube access point, and I wanted to make it a vacuum. Since we didn't have any volcanoes on the main planetoid, I decided to make a system that would allow my duplicant to bring the magma upstairs using a pitcher pump. I then started to brainstorm the functionality of the petroleum boiler and how we could make this as fail-proof as possible. I ended up with a design using robo-miners and auto sweepers, and of course some mechanized airlocks and sensors in order to determine if we need new magma to drop into the system. Also, as with all contraptions, we needed a little bit of active cooling, so I set up a mini steam room. We then had to come up with a way to hook this all up to logic so the doors open and close at the correct timing. There was a lot to take care of and build, but slowly and surely things came together. I filled up the cooling loops and I believed I had all the functionality in place. I then ended up setting up a pitcher pump in the magma biome. This would allow me to grab up to 800 kilograms of magma in one go. I hooked it all up to a transit tube access point. Just like that, we're bringing our first bottle upstairs and dropping it. And that was the birth of our petroleum generation. Eventually, I ended up with 4 bottle emptiers because 800 kilograms could be picked up from the pitcher pump at a time. I then made sure to set up a couple more sensors in order to regulate when my duplicant is bringing new magma, so it doesn't actually do it all the time. With enough magma inside the area, it was time to get this thing rolling. The first magma dropped into the chamber, of course immediately heating up the oil and eventually converted to petroleum at 400 degrees. The resulting petroleum would then travel upstairs and slowly but surely go through the snake corridor to be cooled down by the incoming oil. And just like that, we had access to our first self-produced petroleum that of course we will be making use of with rockets and also a little bit of power. After running it for a bit, it also calmed down and the temperature gradient balanced itself. For some reason I realized that my natural gas setup isn't really working, so I improved on that functionality, but I have no idea what I'm doing here. I just know that it worked after this point. But what I do know is I ended up making this infinite gas storage system for the natural gas that we are accumulating and not using actively for power. By now I also set up the infinite storage for the water, so we could accumulate lots and lots of that. Something I kept doing throughout the series is just expanding the functionality of the geothermal plant so that we dig a little bit deeper into the volcano or maybe add more steam turbines. At this point, honestly, it was a lot about doing some research, also cleaning up. I think I also hooked up the cobalt volcano a little bit late. We didn't end up using that a lot, but the game was now definitely slowing down for me with just one duplicant. I still ended up building this cobalt volcano tamer as mentioned, which I believe in the end wasn't that much of a hassle, at least if I remember this correctly. It's all a little bit blurry after almost 3000 cycles. Either way, at this point I also decided I wanted to clean up some of the gases that were just hanging around the planetoid, and I also made a tiny contraption with 3 mechanized airlocks in order to be able to destroy unwanted gases that I could just lead into this room. I then ended up making this expansion for the power system, allowing me to double the amount we're producing here. At this point, I figured it is time to reach out into space and actually go for other planetoids with our first potential rocket setup. Rockets always produce a lot of heat, so I decided to go for a heatsink below the rocket platform. The heatsink would be consisting out of metal tiles and filled with a little bit of water. I then also ended up installing a tiny cooling system to be able to cool the machinery related to the rockets. At this point in the game, I had to unfreeze another duplicant in order to not lose the game when flying away with a rocket. I believe by now this problem has been fixed. But I basically ended up putting Gene into a single room. They didn't contribute anything to the playthrough other than being a strain on the food and making sure we don't lose the game. To be able to fly rockets, we had to dive a little bit deeper into the research. No problem, we were ready for this. It was then time to set up my first rocket, just a innocent carbon dioxide rocket that would get us to the closest planetoid and back. I then tried to come up with an interior design that would allow us to explore space and also get more data banks. But having a telescope on board was very important. Of course, also some plumbing had to be done in order to make the toilet functional, but with that cute little rocket I felt ready for space. To make the oxygen production inside of the rocket easier, I decided to go for a oxalite refinery supplied with a little bit of gold and oxygen in order to create oxalite that will help us with oxygen production inside the rocket. And with that out of the way, it was time for our first trip, the first rocket launch, a historic milestone, and I believe Nathan was really happy about it. Great moments. And of course, as of this point, we started to explore space, figuring out what and who else we can find. The next few cycles I basically just spent at the telescope going from one tile to the next in the hopes of finding more planetoids, and we actually ended up finding a planetoid with a tungsten volcano on it. In the meantime, of course, I kept on producing data banks and enjoying the spaceflight. We also ended up discovering another planetoid that I never made use of because there's nothing useful on it. Well, to be fair, the moose could be found there, but I didn't take advantage of them. Guys, I only had one duplicant. I also ended up making another trip to the other side, discovering Frostibo, a cruel but more useful ice planetoid. I kept on going into more directions, discovering Hydrini, a water planetoid, and also the magma planetoid. Basically at this point revealing almost all of the existing planetoids in the save game. After I was satisfied, I came back and used the data banks that I received during the space mission to conduct some more research. After this trip, I felt like my research isn't quick enough, so it was time to make a rat-bolt machine, including a more elaborate science system. I had to come up with ways to relay the rat bolts to wherever I need them, which might also be a rat bolt rocket. I figured the system would then be powered by Wii and rat bolt generators, and of course also some storage in the form of rat bolt chambers. All of this required some simple automation and some trial and error to get it to work. At the same time, I also installed an interplanetary launcher at the very top in order to send materials over to other planetoids. At the very bottom of this contraption, it was then time to set up all of the science equipment, which of course was then replacing the old system. I had to add a whole bunch of automation, but I think in the end it turned out pretty nice and it got us through the entirety of the research tree. Once everything was in place and rolling, I was quite happy and decided to rest on the 7th day. With the new science system in place, it was time to research some of the heavy-duty stuff I tried to avoid previously, but there was no reason to hold back anymore. It was now actually time to improve our rocket, so I decided to go for a petroleum engine. We had a petroleum boiler, there was no excuse not to go for it. It was also at this point I decided to build a rat-bolt rocket next to it that we could use to explore space a little bit further. And the petroleum rocket would be our cargo and travel rocket. I also ended up making a tiny rocket for Jean, so I could pack them away there and kind of forget about them. Since I moved everything out of the old biome, including the oil refinery, I decided to also move the polymer press. By now it was a little bit chaotic here, but I decided to go and build it right next to our liquid storage system, and it would then keep producing plastic for us. I also installed a little weight plate system in order to prevent an enormous amount of plastic being crafted. At some point the polymer press can just stop if I don't use it up. It was also that point where we actually were lacking a little bit of power, so I decided to install the engine tune-up machine and allow my duplicants to improve the steam turbines. I then had to come up with a little bit of automation to make sure which machine is actually being provided with the rat bolts depending on which machine requires it. And I think the first priority was always going to the rocket, and then we would be filling up the interplanetary launcher, and at the very end we would be filling up the science machine. But overall, I never felt like we were lacking the rat bolts after this point. With the new rat bolt rocket in place, it was time to go for an exploration spree. I was now capable of traveling 20 tiles, therefore exploring the entirety of the space. And it was also at this point where I started to discover all the missing pieces, such as the temporal tear, and where I could potentially find fullerene. To get the fullerene, I decided to add another rocket platform together with a heatsink, and this would then become my space harvesting rocket. I ended up adding a cargo module and a drill cone, but then I figured I could do the same exact thing with the small rat bolt rocket, so I ended up using that one as our drilling rocket. And just like that, we were ready for our first flight with the rat bolt rocket. Godspeed, my friend. I ended up landing on the second planetoid because I did not quite have enough fuel to make it to the fullerene site and back, so I wanted to fuel up the rat bolt engine. In order to do that, I just ended up using a bunch of manual generators to fill this baby up. After that, I was actually able to make it to the mining site, and all of the nice materials were incoming directly into the rocket. With access to fullerene, it was time to build the molecular forge so that we could take advantage of supercoolant, the best coolant in the game. I ended up building 2 of these with a petroleum storage nearby. This would allow me to alternate between the 2 machines. And after this point, Nathan kept on producing the supercoolant. Of course, this is also manual labor, but it is trickling in slowly. And before we know it, we actually had more than we knew what to do with. At this point, I really wanted to know what it was like on all the different planetoids, so I launched a couple of missions to deploy rovers. I used the rovers in order to explore some of the terrain and already find the important features, make it kind of ready for real duplicants to arrive. I basically did this for all the planetoids, whether I was interested in them or not, because the curiosity just gets the better of me. I even ended up going to the magma planetoid, which in the end was actually a good decision because I used it to get access to some crazy endgame materials. I also ended up scouting the water planetoids, but I don't think it was necessarily worth it. I believe there might be some graphite at the bottom, but I'm not entirely sure. And with that out of the way, I made my way back, now knowing a little bit more about my surroundings and which planetoids might be of more interest to us. The first planetoid I was interested in was the magma planetoid. I had to come up with a spaceship design that would allow me to spend multiple cycles on another planetoid. The rocket turned out pretty nice, I think, and it was capable of completely sustaining my duplicant. I then sent over a whole bunch of payloads in order to ensure that I could build this rocket platform once my duplicant arrives. Not only was this planetoid extremely hot and dangerous, but radiation was also rampant. However, in the end, I still managed to build my rocket platform, the rocket came back to my rescue, and I was capable of entering the module to survive. I then dedicated my time to make things a little bit more secure and to make a plan how to access the niobium volcano. It was a little bit of a tedious process, but I eventually ended up just making a ladder shaft at the very end. And eventually I even succeeded with it, making my way to the precious resource. A lot of the magma I just ended up pumping out, but when you look at this, we have been rewarded with plenty of mineable niobium and of course also the volcano. Naturally, I ended up planning out something to tame the niobium volcano. This was done with some inspiration from other YouTube videos because I was kind of afraid what the niobium volcano is capable of. But we ended up making an entirely different system from our usual volcano tamers in order to extract the heat more reliably. At some point, I just had to make my way back to the main planetoid in order to replenish the rocket, but also get more materials. I also ended up sending some supercoolant over, so I had to have a beacon and a payload opener over there. Once I made my way back to the niobium volcano, it was time to finish the build and get things rolling. There was a little bit of automation involved here as well, mostly to ensure that we don't overfill the cooling area with liquid niobium. Once everything was in place, I was able to introduce the supercoolant and also the steam room water. And with that out of the way, we made sure to have infinite access to niobium as well, which was a huge milestone because of the insane overheat temperature this material provides. At this point, I went back to the second planetoid in order to tap deeper into the uranium biome and start collecting some of that precious refined stuff. Just scoop it out. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I also had to quickly make my way back to the niobium volcano in order to add some more functionality, and then at this point it was actually starting to run and the niobium was dripping on the weight plate, starting to cool down, and so here I was shaking a little bit, but it turned out to be functional in the end. Yeah, now looking back at this was really worth it. I got hundreds of tons of niobium before it actually failed the first time. For some reason I had the glorious idea to then start pumping out the magma from the magma planetoid. I don't remember exactly why I wanted to do that. I guess it had something to do with that urge to just mine up all the planetoids, but at some point I realized this just doesn't make any sense. Though I have to admit, it took quite a while for me to figure this out and I just kept on trying. I mean, look at this. What am I doing with my life? So yeah, after a while I ended up with something like this and my OCD was defeated. After the magma planetoid, I was interested in the resin tree and also taming the tungsten volcanoes. So I decided to make my way over with a duplicant in order to build a rocket platform, get that rocket back down. I also installed a couple of solar panels which didn't end up helping much on this planetoid, but most importantly we revealed experiment 52b, which is going to be our sole source of resin. I tried to get this planetoid prepared by digging out the terrain and also encasing the tree, which is dangerous. I then went ahead and made a little setup for the tungsten volcano that isn't submerged in magma. I also got all the usual functionality in place in order to cool down the tungsten to steam temperature. Something I had to get prepared is food delivery for the resin tree. And I decided to make a little chilling system for food that I'm gonna send over, so it gets sent over in a frozen state. I also ended up setting up a second interplanetary launcher just dedicated to send food over to the resin tree. With the help of some supercoolant, I would be getting the food to below -20 degrees, after which it would travel up into the interplanetary launcher being sent over to its final destination. I made my way over back to the resin tree in order to set up a beacon and a payload opener, and I also prepared the necessary cooling to take care of that. It was then time to activate the tungsten volcano, get it analyzed and get out of the room. At the very bottom, I tried to come up with a design that will then take care of converting the resin into isoresin, but I've never been quite happy how this turned out. I mean, hey, in the end it turned out functional, but there were some slight errors and glitches happening with it. that left me kept wondering. So over time I added more and more automation to try and mitigate the problems when I just have rebuilt the entire thing. Eventually I kind of got it working though. The tree is now eating the food I sent over and some resin is being produced that will then be shipped downstairs. Now that we had access to hot iso resin and also the tungsten, I wanted to make an additional cooling area that would bring it down to agreeable 20 or so degrees. The first resin arrived in the chamber and now we're transferring the heat in order to convert it into solid iso resin. This in the beginning seemed to work out, but then I ran into multiple issues and I just don't want to talk about it anymore. Just be aware, we were now producing iso resin. The iso resin was then shipped through the additional cooling area, going all the way down to a nice temperature before actually being brought over to the interplanetary launcher. The interplanetary launcher I powered with just one rat bolt generator, which was a huge mistake. I should have made a dedicated system for this for it to go a little bit quicker. Now we were also running into power issues, so I had to make sure to add batteries. Oh yeah, and of course, after pumping out the entirety of the biome, I just carelessly launched my rocket and realized that it's now filling up again with carbon dioxide. Well done, Nathan. You won't believe how many of these mistakes happen in almost 3000 cycles. Because materials were now being shipped to the main planetoid, I also had to make sure to install a beacon and payload opener system in this place. At this point, I felt a little bit unsatisfied with the amount of iso resin we are producing. Despite the fact we were sending over all of the food, it just wasn't enough. So I wanted to go for a fish tank that would be supplying some fresh fish for the tree in due time. In order to do that, I just made a little encasement and decided to put a mini pod on top of it, so in case we can spawn some food from the printing pod, we would be able to drop it right into the tree chamber. I was lucky enough to actually get some fish to spawn pretty quickly, so I decided to just go for it and give them their initial setup. The system at this time was very simple. I just had the fish and the eggs all in one place. It was not a good system and of course needed some additional care. By now, the tungsten volcano decided to kick in, so additionally to the iso resin, we now also had to cool and ship this material. For some reason, I took a break from the fish tank in order to start hollowing out Frostibo, the ice planetoid with the temporal tear on it. I just required a rocket platform to get my rocket down and be able to survive for a couple of cycles. After a while, I actually ended up with a completely hollowed out planetoid and I noticed there are a whole bunch of iron volcanoes on it. I didn't feel like we were lacking the iron, but I felt satisfied with the results right there. By now we went through a whole generation of fish and this way we would just get nowhere. Something had to be done. However, I was more interested in doing something absolutely useless, which was creating a molten iron lake. It was an absolutely brilliant idea and I couldn't have used my time better. So I went over there and of course made it my first task to clean everything up. I even got some old-fashioned coal power generation in the joint to help me with the pumping of the gases and everything. I then started to isolate, analyze and hook up the iron volcanoes. And then once I felt ready, I started to remove the tiles. But it wasn't easy because igneous rock would start to melt immediately, creating rock gas. It was just crazy. You know, recording this recap makes me question my entire life. Either way, we ended up with our first drops of molten iron here at the very bottom, starting our lake. Incredible. At this point, I started to pay attention to the temporal tear opener and decided to actually start filling it up with the rat bolts. So we had to come up with a little system with Weaswards and rat bolt generators to eventually fill this up. So I just brainstormed a couple of ideas. I intended to supply this with coal because it was a very temporary system. We only need to charge this up one time, after which we can tear this apart again. I then basically allowed the room to be filled up with carbon dioxide by the coal generators and cooled down by the Weaswards. I also had to install a couple of mini pods on at least 5 planetoids in order to activate the temporal tear opener in the first place. Once that was done, I was able to activate the system, get those rat bolts generated, and this could just run in the background as I was doing other stuff. After just a few cycles, we already charged it up to 15%. The solution seemed good enough to me, so I went back home. I then decided to spend a whole bunch of cycles just inside the science module in order to unlock all of the research. We went all the way in and unlocked everything there was to gain from the research tree. This was certainly a huge endeavor and took maybe 1 or 2 cycles longer than I first anticipated. by the time we were done, I still wasn't satisfied with the amount of food we're creating for the resin tree. It was time for an additional farm right below our existing berry sludge farm. I considered my options and in the end decided to go for mushrooms. So my first goal was just to set up a platform and get natural tiles going. I made sure to measure everything out so the pips would be able to plant all the mushrooms in the end. After finishing the first floor and successfully planting a couple of mushrooms, I decided to make a liquid lock here to pump everything out and potentially also make a second layer of mushrooms. The mushrooms would then be delivered to my cooling system and automatically being shipped to the resin tree. And just like that, we ended up with a second layer of mushrooms. It took a really long time for the pips to plant everything, but eventually they did it. While waiting for the mushrooms, just for the giggles, I decided to go for a nuclear reactor, not for the power, but for the nuclear waste. I just built this for the giggles. I did not actually end up using the nuclear waste, but we could have. The main thing was to get a nuclear reactor in the joint and make it functional in order to produce that juicy nuclear waste. I ended up with a reactor room like this. I would design it differently if I could redo it this time around. But you know, at this point, after 2,500 cycles, I was just becoming delusional. I tried to make it somewhat self-regulating by adding a couple of sensors, making sure we don't add too much water. Sometimes we need to extract the water. But it turned out in the coming cycles, I had to go back in there at least 2 more times in order to fix stuff. I then made a little encasement out of airflow tiles at the bottom to store an infinite amount of nuclear waste that would then be producing the radiation for us. I also built some functionality so we wouldn't be adding too much refined uranium. This system was actually really helpful since I was able to turn off the reactor within a cycle tops. But now that we got it running, radiation was unleashed. I then decided to leave the reactor be for a little while and make my way back to the resin tree planetoid in order to improve the fish situation here. The way I wanted to achieve this is by making a balm lily farm right here that would be feeding the fish with fresh seeds to make them reproduce much quicker. Of course, this would have to be a wild farm and everything would have to be automated because my duplicant wouldn't be on the planetoid to take care of things. This of course also included item shipping and a whole bunch of cooling. A nice feature about balm lilies is that they don't require anything other than some chlorine to grow. This way I wouldn't have to use any pip trickery to make a farm for the fish. At this point, of course, I ran into power issues again, so I conducted a plan to use the hydrogen vents to produce more power. I figured we could be running 2 of the hydrogen generators at all times using both of the vents, and then still have a little bit of overproduction when we actually don't use them. I also hooked up the second hydrogen vent. This would just be pumping into the first area where we cool it down slightly before putting it into the generators. But by now overheating wasn't an issue because of the niobium we have. Not long after, we started pumping the hydrogen into the gas reservoirs and then back into the hydrogen generators. And now we were finally back with enough power once again. I would then go through multiple iterations of making the functionality of the fish tank a little bit better. So we have 2 breeding fish and then the rest would just wait for their inevitable demise. But I ended up making a couple of mistakes. In the end, it worked phenomenally. We were getting dozens and dozens of fish, but I did spend more time on this than I care to admit. I used a combination of sensors and weight plates to determine how many eggs we still need inside the breeding chamber, and all of the other eggs would go into a waiting chamber to be fed to the tree after their death. I ended up making separate delivery systems depending on which items I want to deliver where, and so I could also decide for some of the items to be shipped back to the main planetoid. So yeah, just a little bit of automation and everything worked out. I ended up building much more gas storage just because I had the space for it. And now it was basically time to wrap this up. I supplied a little bit of seeds to actually tame the first few fish and make them breed even faster. I was now happy with the fish tank functionality and it was all about just wrapping things up here. At this point in the playthrough, I felt like slowly but surely wrapping up the series, so I decided to go for a round of cleanup and also fixed a bunch of minor things that I still had on my list. I felt like there was one more thing in this playthrough to make it feel complete, and that is a liquid hydrogen setup. I got myself started with a Rodriguez oxygen producer, ended up encasing it nicely and giving it some functionality. I then prepared the top area, which was reserved for liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. The very top portion would be reserved to regulate the temperature inside a steam room, and I ended up actually connecting it to the reactor chamber. I simply connected the two rooms, relayed the power, and at this point I wanted to go for insulation all the way around the liquid oxygen and hydrogen chambers, but I think I ended up opting for ceramic for the liquid oxygen because it's easier to regulate. I then added some sensors, pumps and reservoirs in order to create a coolant cycle stable enough to sustain the temperature. It was important to keep the distances short and to use insulation materials where necessary. It was then time to introduce the supercoolant, and of course I was still lacking the insulation material. Gosh, this freaking resin tree can be glad that I actually need it. At least in the end, I was capable of producing my first liquid oxygen, which was a glorious moment. Once again, I felt much more accomplished. Another thing I felt like we're missing that I've never actually done in a playthrough is build a monument. I felt like the series cannot end without actually building one of them, even though it's a huge waste of material. I tried to make the chamber look as appealing as possible, and it was time to set up that statue. This statue would be built in honor of the two duplicants I had to kill off in the beginning, signifying they should remain with a positive attitude. It was definitely a respectable moment here with the statue, so I decided to take this a step further, and I set up two tasteful memorials, 2751 cycles after killing them. I know, I'm too generous. Here we have Marie being delivered, and I even slowed the game down just for this occasion. I then figured out that we can actually change how the statue looks, so I thought screw the thumbs up. Here we can have a look at the Iron Lake. It is phenomenal. It was definitely worth spending 5 hours on this. By now I completely charged up the temporal tear opener, and I figured it was time to just shoot it. Here we go. This was an absolute glorious moment, and of course we were greeted with meteor showers. Now I learned after this the meteor showers just keep on spawning as long as you don't reload the save game. So just save and reload if you want the showers to stop. However, they actually come with fullerene just in case you want to farm it. So ridiculously enough, I just spent a whole bunch of time waiting for these showers to stop and prevent more damage on the planetoid. I then figured I want to complete the main planetoid and just took the rest of the terrain parts that was still intact. And then finally we were capable of producing our first liquid hydrogen, a glorious moment that will allow us to fill hydrogen rockets, the most advanced type of rocket, I believe. After a very long time, I was finally able to complete both of the chambers. We were already bursting with liquid oxygen, we just had to wait a little bit longer for the hydrogen to keep up. I then decided it would be time for the rocket platform nearby, set up a hydrogen rocket so we can directly feed the fuel into it without a long distance. I decided the platform is a little bit too high up, but lower down I would have better access to the in and outputs. We needed fuel tanks and liquid oxidizer tanks, and I just wanted them really close. I finished my cleanup work on the main planetoid. It was just a little bit full of nasty gases, but nowhere we actually travel without an atmosuit. And at this point I felt like it's time to finish the game. I still completed some chores around the planetoid to leave it more or less tidy, or at least tidier, but now it was all about just making a simple interior for the rocket so that we could send Jean through the temporal tear. I fueled up the rocket once and without any further ado sent Jean on their way. I would make a straight line for the temporal tear, and Jean would feel horrible because for some reason I forgot to set up a toilet. I figured you wouldn't need that in the afterlife. And then after so many cycles, we were finally able to make it into the temporal tear. Oh, it's beautiful. Alright guys, this completes the recap of my adventures in the Ultimate Base 3.0. Thank you so much for joining me in this, and to everyone who supported the series watching it along. Again, if you want to watch it, there will be links in the description and in the pinned comment to the entire 74 episodes playlist. Have a great time, and hopefully I'm gonna catch you in the next series. Bye bye.